Here is the life cycle of our bike reviews. But how did today's bike start off at neutral, go through all of this, only to end up back in the same spot? What the hell happened here and here, and why is it all your fault? Welcome to the balancing act, no, the game of bike design. Now, when playing, you have a couple of different options. You can, of course, make a bike just like everyone else. Throw a 4-bar on it, maybe include an adjustable rear end, and call it good. Or you can go your own way. Now, this is a game that previously you might have enjoyed as an observer, or even judge, jury, and executioner of bikes that you've owned. However, if you've been frequenting internet message boards over the years and voiced some opinions, well, somebody's been listening, and they've made the bike that you've been calling out for. The question is, now that you're playing the game yourself, can you make a good bike? The best thing about the internet is its ability to democratize, to level, to at least give a chance for equity of opinion. The worst thing about the internet is its ability to embolden, to inflame, to embellish half-truths and give equality of opinion, potentially irrespective of facts. So what happens when you put your ear to the void and try and tune out the fiction before filling in the gaps with some expertise of your own? Well, you might end up with something like this, the Priority Vanth, trick or treat. Priority are a brand that specialises in belt-driven bikes. Their greatest strength and weakness is that they're not from the core mountain bike industry, separate enough to not design on inertia, but big enough to land and make an impact. That said, to me, the Vanth seems to be the manifestation and not genesis of design ideas. But let's play a game. Let's play cherry pick the frame feature. First, the pinkest cherry of them all, freshly picked from the mountain biking community's biggest comment section. Slow, clunky, often not as fast as they suggest online. The members themselves obviously play a huge role in what mountain biking is. And many of them championed the idea of the Gearbox as a silver bullet for bike design. Better weight distribution, less servicing, better ground clearance, no vulnerable mech to break, and potentially cheaper in the long run. It's all there. The only problem with the Gearbox has typically been the Gearbox itself. Lots of beautiful promises, lots of waiting at the altar. But they have gotten better in recent years, particularly with the advent of Pinion's electronic smart shift system, which means I can confidently say that this Gearbox shifts as well as a bike from maybe 2015? Now, that sounds like a dig, and it is a bit, but in some ways it shows how far gearboxes have come, because honestly, the shifting from derailleurs was pretty good a decade ago. Some cherries, however, aren't as sweet, such as the looks of that walrus tusk rear end that is reminiscent of polygons of old. Now, those polygons were grip-tastic, but also flex-tastic. They offered an amazing ability to track in off-cambers as each arm worked independently of one another, like Peter Crouch doing the robot. But they also chewed up shocks for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. To get around this, Priority have worked hard to have more of a universal flex going through that rear end whilst isolating it away from the shock. They've also not used a trunnion mount, instead using a traditional eyelet on both ends of the shock, allowing the system to have a bit more give. Here at the channel, we don't really talk about money and we focus on performance. In fact, over on our Patreon, each bike gets its own podcast breakdown as me and Remy go through the nitty-gritty. But on this bike, it is worth referencing, if only because it represents the first real gateway into gearbox bikes at something like good value for a lot of riders. And you certainly do get a lot of bike for your money, both figuratively and literally. our bike, ready to rip, is certainly no flyweight. In some ways, this bike seems tailor-made for, well, me. I don't care how much it weighs, I just want something that's functional, I ride all year in all conditions, and I don't really care what it looks like. When you do see the bike, it does give an air of Homer Simpson tries his hand at bike design. But what is this lump of funk like out on the trail? Well, let's start with chapter 1. What the hell happened here? Hopping on this bike for your first ride is something of an underwhelming experience. That weight is very apparent. Plus, there seems to be some extra drag in the already quite draggy gearbox system as it beds in. On this bike, climbing it, honestly, it's almost comical, at least initially. I've never done a ride before on my normal morning loop. I've checked my watch and thought, I can't believe I'm only this far. I'm wondering, really, where the time is going. Don't be disheartened too quickly though, because in my experience, the gearbox does bed in to feel a bit quicker after the initial rides. However, there is no way to get around the weight. That extra structure, remember, the complicated linkage, the gearbox itself, combined with the drag from the belt-driven system that runs through those two idlers. It gives a bike that is honestly pretty sluggish. On one hand, there is loads of grip. On the other hand, it just feels lethargic. Let me show you a very simple experiment. Here is Remco Vanth, a decade of pro racing behind him, World Cup podiums, national titles, beautiful golden hair that flows in the wind like a donkey on Brighton Beach, and he's aboard the latest gearbox bike. And here is me, a bloke, never raced, simply doesn't possess a sprint, and his only form of training is walking Toblerone, the Shih Tzu. They will simply have a drag race from a standing start. The Priority does do some things very well, but a sprightly bike, it certainly isn't. In fact, it can seemingly undo a decade of professional racing and training to turn you into a bloke that drinks beer, eats baked beans and farts. But let me tell you what happened here. On natural trails where tracking is needed and grip is reduced, this thing is great. Yes, the suspension is sorted, but part of that also comes down to the flex. This bike is comfortable and easy to turn in, but then again can also feel like there are certain situations where it begins to feel overwhelmed. In high compressions, should you be tickling the old coward lever, the rearward axle path, combined with the compression of the suspension under braking due to a high amount of anti-rise and the flex, it can feel like there's a lot going on. This is a very, very, very good bike. And the more I rode it, the more I respected it. The geometry is great, the handling is balanced, and yes, the better weight distribution of the gearbox also really helps. However, it needs to justify itself with some simple but clean questions. Is the suspension good enough to justify all of that weight and complication? Honestly, for me, no. It's a good rear end, but better than that Pivot Firebird? Maybe not. Miles ahead of the pure simplicity of the Raw. Not really. But both these bikes are far faster and more efficient pedaling because there is less drag and weight. This bike is designed to be fast when descending. So let's tune in to Remy's Racer's Lap to hear his thoughts and see how fast he can make it go. It'll be interesting to see how this bike shakes out between our tech and flow splits.
Riding the Vanth on our test track has been unique to every other bike I've put a time down with. I wasn't expecting the fastest time, especially with the wet fall conditions we're having, but the bike was composed in a way that I haven't experienced. The lack of chain noise, chain feedback, and chain rattle gives you a sense that the bike is hugging the ground. Possibly placebo, but a good feeling nonetheless. And it really held its own when it was on the clock. For such a sluggish bike on the pedals to the trail, I was also impressed with how well it fared on our section of flow trail, where pedaling and pumping to carry speed is really important.
The problem with this bike is that it rides best on trails that you pedal to the top of, but to get to the top of the trails that it shines on, you have to put up the thing that it's worst at, pedaling. It's got a lot of anti-squat and loads of traction, but you cannot overcome the weight and the drag. In fact, the pedaling it's best at is the type you probably won't want to do because of the type of bike that it is. Up tech climbs, it's butter smooth and offers so much grip. That rearward axle path, combined with the low unsprung mass of the rear end, gives a bike that offers genuinely amazing seated traction. But do I think many true single-track climbers will want a bike so heavy? Not really. I suppose half of me really respects the Vanth, but the critic in me questions what we really need our bikes to do. Do we want our bikes to be a blank check when it comes to certain attributes, such as weight or descending characteristics, if they compromise the bike inherently in so many other regards? To me, this is a well-designed bike, but so much about good design is about compromise, and I don't think they've got the balance quite right. This bike has 3 daggers in its graphic to highlight and allude to its unique look that features that third central beam. In some ways, it's a cruel touch of irony, because it suffers from 3 fatal blows. Is it stiff enough for how heavy it is? No. Is it so good at tracking compared to all the other bikes? Not really. Can it justify its limitations with all-out descending performance? No. So, what should happen to the Vanth? Well, you should buy one. Yes, you, because you, the audience, is responsible for this bike in its entirety. The gearbox, the high pivot, the reckless disregard for weight. Okay, I might be in the docks with you on that one. But it really doesn't matter though, because ultimately Vanth made a bike that they really want and they think the audience really wants. So if you do indeed want the gearbox bike of your dreams, then it's time to put your money where your mouth is and order the bloody thing. Something that doesn't cost you a penny is of course subscribing to QuarterHP. So please do, as it really helps support the channel. Thanks, and we'll catch you next time.